presentations. If at any time you cannot hear, please let it be known. One other thing, on the other side of the coin, if you have a question, please speak loudly so that everybody in the room can hear the question. Or not? Well, now let's go back to 1941. Maybe we ought to just shut off the air conditioning to make it a little more like 1941. Show of hands? I guess I won't be ruled on that. As I look around this group tonight, I see some World War II veterans. And I would like to have room on this program for everyone to tell a story. But consider this, there are, even today, World War II veterans numbering in the millions, and each one has a different story. I would like to take just a minute here and recognize these individuals, and anyone who is a World War II veteran would you stand now, please. Stand up, fellas. Standing, so I don't overlook anybody. What is your name, sir? And in what branch of the service were you?
Air Force.
And did you serve overseas?
No.
You were in the States, and for how long did you serve?
3.5 years.
Okay, thank you very much. You, sir. May we have your people stand up? Would you give me your name, please, and your... Louder, please, sir. Okay? Let it roar.
John Wilkerson, machine gunner on a B-25 bomber.
And were you stationed in the Pacific or the
North Africa.
North Africa. I see. How long were you overseas, John? 2 years. Great. Let's go over here to this side. Mr. Zimmer, stand up and identify yourself, will you?
Yeah, Paul Zimmer. I guess most of you have heard about me in the papers and things. I was the 101st Airborne, and of course we were the ones that Ike would sacrifice we had to in World War II. We were in Normandy beaches. We went in the glider in Normandy beaches behind them. We went into Holland. And there was one division selected for Bastogne. He selected the 101st to be surrounded. He knew it was going to be. And so I got a new film just released last winter. And it's got 51 minutes. I'm going to have to cut it down to this here. But I'll be showing the third Thursday in September. So I'll cut it down to whatever length it needs to be. But it's all actual footage in World War II. Every bit of it's actual footage. It was the time we left England until we crossed the German lines, over the top, behind the German lines into Holland. But every bit of it's actual footage of World War II. Now, that's pretty hard to find, but I've got it.
Hal Gray, would you introduce yourself?
My name is Hal Gray, and I was overseas with the 36th Infantry Division. Later with the 6th Armored Infantry Division. The only difference between the two, one walked and the other one rode.
All right, who's next here? Come on, Jerry, stand up here. Oh, excuse me, go ahead.
Hey, he's up.
He's up. He's got the jump.
Jerry Coberly. I went in the Army of Company D, the 113th Medical Regiment out of Rensselaer. And when they cut the 38th down from the old Square Division to the new Streamline Division, I went to the 148th General Hospital. We went to started to the Philippines. We wound up in Hawaiian Islands. After about a year there, they sent me back to the States in the cavalry. And here a year, then I went to Europe with the 102nd Infantry Division. They put us in the newly formed 9th Army and gave us to General Montgomery.
You must have had about 3 years overseas, didn't you?
I don't know, close to it.
Jerry Pettit, let's hear from you.
Well, I was in 3 years. Went into the military police. And that was kind of dull. I thought I was something right. So I got into the infantry. Was more up our before. But anyhow, I was the 26th Infantry Division. Thanks.
Calhoun.
I went in with the 113th, I was just telling you this,
Oh, you had a lot of service, didn't you?
No.
Didn't you win, the
5 years.
and the rest of us?
And I went with the 66th Infantry Division, New York. About 3 years of combat.
Great. Bob Jacks, Navy.
Yep. Yeah, my name is Bob Jacks. I grew up around here, and I graduated in 1939. And I thought I was encompassed by the nation where I was fought in the war. They were drafting people to these wars, but I decided to volunteer. So I volunteered for 6 years, and I was on an aircraft carrier for 3 years. Pearl Harbor was our home port. We were at sea when Pearl Harbor was bombed, so they didn't find us. So, let's see. So I was actually in it when the word go to the quit. But I'm going to talk to her later on.
So I'm Bob.
I'm being a speech maker, I've never said that.
Well, several of these fellows will be involved in this program a little later. Now, are there any other veterans here?
Bob
Yes,
Nagel.
Bob Nagel.
I was in the Air Force, CBI, over in China, Burma, India. We flew supplies over to China.
What was your job, Bob?
I was on the ground crew, loaded planes and getting ready to go over there.
I never did get to the Pacific Theater myself, and I'm told that it was real easy for those pilots to navigate across the hump, because all they had to do was follow the trail of wrecked planes. Any others? Okay, let's go right ahead here. In formulating this program, I tried to give a whole cross-section of that period of time and the various services. Air Force, Army, Navy, Marine Corps, Merchant Marine, Coast Guard, so forth. And I struck out, first of all, on the Marine Corps. A lot of those men didn't come back. And when you find a Marine veteran in this area who was involved with invasions in the Pacific Islands, you know that you're talking to a true survivor, because their ranks were shattered. I found one man in Madeireville. I didn't know him, called him. His health support can't do it. He said, well, I'm on oxygen. I can't get up and talk. He led me to another man. And in talking to that fellow, this was right after the 50th anniversary of the Virginia invasion. And I talked to this man and asked him if he couldn't participate in this program. And he said, no, Phil, I cannot. I have never talked about it. The other night the television was on and they were showing a documentary on the invasion of Iwo Jima. And my wife was shocked because I'd never even told her. And when I started to cry, why, then we shut it off. Another man I contacted, Marine veteran, considered it wrong. I contacted him 4 times trying to get a commitment. And finally he said, Phil, I just cannot do it. So there will be no Marine veteran in this program. The only veteran I ever encountered in this area from the Merchant Marine was our friend Tom Clark. Tom was killed about 6 years ago. He had quite a tumultuous term. and had his ship torpedoed off on Mandarin 2 times. Spent 10 days in a lifeboat in the Caribbean. They had to bury one of his shipmates at sea, and finally made their way to the Dominican Republic. Well, December the 8th, 1941, Germany declared war on the United States. We had our hands full with Japan. And at that point, it was a very, very rude awakening for all of us, because we were virtually defenseless. We were highly vulnerable on the West Coast. The major part of the Pacific Fleet was lying in the harbor of Pearl Harbor. It was necessary to intern Japanese Americans. Now, there's been a lot of Monday morning quarterback discussion about that, but it was the thing to do at the time. These Monday morning quarterbacks could not tell any of us which of those Japanese Americans that were interned were 100% loyal to this country, and which ones were a little iffy. And we were so vulnerable and in such a treacherous, precarious position in this country that we couldn't take any chances at all. The Atlantic Ocean was full of enemy submarines, and at that point, most adult Americans faced the greatest necessity of their lives. Let me say that again. Most adult Americans faced the greatest necessity of their lives. The reason for that was that in a matter of 48 hours, the whole world, the area of the world, became our battlefield. We were unprepared, unarmed, and there we were. So with this in mind, let's get cracking on World War II. Again, I want you to know your questions are welcome, but please speak louder. And if I don't, let me know. Our first speaker this evening is a man who's very generous with his time. He got up early this morning. His address is Monticello. He got up early this morning, prepared for a day's work at Carnegie Valley School, where he teaches history and government. He hasn't been home yet. He's agreed to come here tonight and give us a story of some of the high school World War II classes that he's teaching. And he has a remarkable background for this, because he was a member of the military service for many years and is a retired infantry colonel. Let me introduce Jerry. Come ahead, Jerry Hoover.
You see these, can most of you see, can you read this if you're not behind a pole? Is it legible? I tried it out. I hope it's okay. These are generally speaking, these are the things that I would like to look at, and my part of this program is to talk about the home front, because I certainly, as all of the people in this room are, and I'm indebted to these veterans who did so much for this country so that we can live the way we do today in this tremendous struggle that the nation went through. So anyway, I'd like to talk a little bit about where we're at on December the 6th. For you people who are taking notes, I do not have a handout. So you're welcome to this, and if it's necessary, well, I'll be glad to provide you notes later. But this is generally the format here. A little bit about December the 6th, then December the 7th, then the tremendous migration that went on in the United States as people moved away from certain places, moved to certain places, so forth and so on. And then the role of women and blacks and how that changed dramatically during this period of time. We're talking about, again, 1940 to 1945. Then a little bit about rationing and shortages, and then to wind it up with trends, fads, and follies. Now, Winston Churchill said at one time, he said there were 3 impossible tasks in this world. One is to climb a wall leaning towards you. Another is to kiss a young lady that's leaning away from you. And the third is to talk to a group of people about information in which they're already familiar. So I'm in that situation I feel tonight. So to begin, let's take a look at where the United States was on December the 6th, 1941. First of all, there were 134 million Americans. 56 million were involved in the labor force. 1.5 million were in the military. Now, that may be a little bit surprising to you to find out that there's 1.5 million in the military, but particularly in light of the fact that during the 30s we had just a cadre army. But in the 40s, after Poland was attacked by the Germans, then there was a great scurry around this country to come to preparedness. And of course, there was a great hue and cry by the isolationists in America not to be prepared and not to get involved in any more foreign wars, because they'd gone through World War I and they just didn't want to do that. There were also 4 million men who were unemployed. The average income per year for an American, the median income, was $2,000 per year. By December 6th, 1941, the nation was already spending $75 million a day on defense. So you can see that there was a lot of money being spent for that purpose by this time. One of the big problems in the defense situation was the fact that there was not enough scrap metal to keep the steel mills going, and that basically was our own fault because we had sold 200 million tons of scrap metal to the Japanese from 1935 to 1940, and then of course they threw it back at us a little bit later on in this story. Spending was up. I'm talking about consumers were spending more money. The Copacabana nightclub in New York was their gross receipts was $50,000 a week. Jack Dempsey's and Toots Shor, $20,000 a week in gross sales. So you see, we're starting to spend money again after the Depression. Another barometer, there were retail sales for Christmas in 1941 was $54 million. That was 10 million more than 1940 and 6 million more than the previous high, which was 1929. So we're starting to come out of the Depression a little bit. On December the 5th, Congress voted a 2 million man army. So we're going to kick this up. This figure here is going to go up another 500,000. December the 5th, they voted that, and they also voted an $8 billion increase in defense spending. And then the last thing we have here is the word OHIO, Ohio, and that stood for over the hill in October. So there was not tremendous morale among those people who were in the armed forces. They were looking forward to coming back home. They were on short enlistments, and they were looking forward to coming back home. Now let's take a look at what I call hysteria. December the 7th, I was 7 years old. 1941, I was 7 years old. I was in the 2nd grade at Monticello, in the Monticello schools. And so I remember listening to the radio and hearing about Pearl Harbor, and my mother came in and listened to it, and she said, "You better go out and get your dad." And he was out at the barn, And so I went out and got him, and he listened, and he said, they both looked at one another, and here I was, little kids, you know, with my brother that's 2 years younger than I was. I didn't know what was going on, and my dad said, "This means war." And I didn't know, that's the first time I ever heard the word, war. And my mother, the next thing she said was, "Do you think you'll have to go?" And my dad was about 42 years old. And so he, you know, was in the, but he said, "Maybe I won't have to." And then she said, "Well, will Bud have to go?" That was her brother, who was 10 years younger. And he said, "Well, I expect he will." And she started crying. And so there I am, again, a little kid, you know, under the table, listening to all this, and my brother, and we listened all night long to what went on you know, there was, I remember this specifically, and I've never read this, but I remember lumber ships being sank, and I remember tankers being reported being sank. And those were two things that I remember distinctly. Then let's take a look at what was going on in San Francisco on the night of December the 7th. You see, the San Franciscos, as Phil has so aptly pointed out, they were defenseless. And so they thought that there were Japanese planes over San Francisco. And so they started shooting at the sky. I suppose it was something like Saddam, you know, in the Desert Storm. But they were shooting at the sky, and there were reports that the Japanese planes were there. And I'd like to read for you just a moment what a three-star general, who was the Fourth Army Commander, General John L. DeWitt, this is his quote: "I don't think there's any doubt the planes came from a carrier." That was his statement on December the 7th in the evening. Now, let's return to Hoover, South Building. I go to school. I get to school at the South Building in Monticello, Indiana. There's 2 grades, first grade, second grade. Miss Long's in the first grade, Miss Gosshorn's in the second grade. My buddy Jerry Brown, we're in the same grade. We get off the bus. We go into the school. Both the teachers are crying. Now, we've seen our mothers cry because they think their husbands are leaving and so forth, and now we got the teachers crying because, you know, I didn't know anything about it then, but Miss Long, both of them were young teachers. I suppose Miss Gosshorn was 32 and Miss Long was probably about 22. And Miss Long, now I know it, but I didn't know anything then, she was good looking. And Miss Gosshorn wasn't bad looking. And they both had fiancés and boyfriends. And so they're crying because they know this is going to happen. So now we sheepishly, you know, get in our seats. And we're sitting there, and every once in a while she'd jump up and grab her handkerchief and go out in the hall, and they'd hug one another and cry. And Brownie and I, we're looking at one another, you know, and we're scared to death. We don't know what in the dickens is going on. They're talking about war again, a name that we had no idea about. And then we went out for the first period recess. So we go to recess, and in the middle of the recess, the superintendent of schools, Hack Gillespie, rolled up in front of the school. And he had a 1937 or 38 Plymouth, and the doors came open, you know, from the front. And he stopped the car, and the door flew open, and he jumped down, and he ran, and he said, "Get the children together! Get the children together! Air raid drill! Air raid drill!" Well, my gosh, we didn't, you know, by this time we're getting pretty scared. And so they took us down to this second grade building, to the restroom. The boys went to the boys' restroom, and the girls went to the girls' restroom. My spot was right by the urinal. I could go there today and sit there. And you put your hands over your head, your head between your knees, and you get ready for the bomb. See? And so we did that about 9 times that day. By the time I got home that night, you know, I swear to goodness, you know, I was looking around wondering, you know, they're coming, you know, where? And so everything changed right then. And then let's hear what General DeWitt explained the next morning to the San Franciscans. Here's what he had to say: "There are more damn fools in this locality than I have ever seen. Death and destruction are likely at any moment. There were Japanese planes over our city. They were traced out to sea. Why they didn't drop bombs, I do not know. Maybe it would be better if they did. It would wake this city up." Now I want you to take a look at something. I tell my classes this story. Mr. Gillespie went ahead and served in the service. But let's take a look at the logic behind this. Now, if you take this map and you say, well, where was the Japanese Navy on December the 8th? They were about right out here, right? They were about right here. Now, they could have been right here. As Phil pointed out, they could have been right here, and we wouldn't have known. Even if they were right there, though, let's look at what really was the situation. The Zero had about 400 miles, range. So that means in order to get to the South Building in Monticello, Indiana, they would have had to refuel about 5 or 6 times. We've been going across here. And then I imagine that the high command in the war planning that went on before this sneak attack is going to say, hoochie coochie hachi. What we need to do is get Hoover and Brownie in the South Building in Monticello, Indiana, because they are the key to winning this war. But you see, I tell you these stories because it was hysteria all over this land, because we were unprepared. We weren't ready. In New York, that same day, I thought this was interesting for you people who were in the Army. It said there were 90 volunteers for the Army. There were 700 for the Navy. There was 500 for the Marines. And the Navy turned 1,000 away. Those guys knew. They didn't want to get in the Army. In New York, on December the 9th, they had their first scare. 1:25 p.m., they said, there's enemy planes. All the schools let out, defense plants shut down. 4 o'clock, they found out that the planes were ours. The state guard units. The National Guard, as you pointed out, the 113th had been mobilized, and so there were state guard units organized all over the country that took the place. There were mostly World War I veterans and other people who were assigned to man the armories and so forth over the state. In Georgia, the state guard unit immediately took off and went out to the ocean and started looking for the Germans. Now, the Germans could not even get across the English Channel to get to the English, but yet the Georgians were sure they were going to advance through Georgia, and so they were out doing their job. The governor of Wisconsin said that he called for all 25,000 licensed deer hunters to get busy and get ready to defend the state of Wisconsin against a sure invasion. There were a couple exceptions. The Civil Air Patrol, now we're talking about now a little bit longer period of time. The Civil Air Patrol did a good job, from all that I can read in the research that I've done. That these people were, before long, they were doing their job. They were out in their own airplanes looking for submarines and did a lot toward deterring German submarines along particularly the Atlantic coast. There were 80,000 men and women in that organization, 20,000 cadets between the ages of 15 and 18. And then the Office of Civil Defense. The Office of Civil Defense, they had 5,600,000 volunteers by the end of January in 1942, and 5,600,000 by the end of January 42, and 12 million by the end of 1943. And these people were spotters, air wardens, and particularly on the coast, they were responsible for making sure that they got blackouts and going through the procedures for that. So those two have a little better idea of what they were doing than the aforementioned people. Now let's take a look at migration. There's one thing that I found out that was surprising to me as I prepared for this. First of all, small business, and I'm particularly staying away from this war industry defense plans thing because, as the format called for, Bob Brown's going to talk about that. But anyway, small business really suffered during the war. Small business suffered because in order to survive, you had to have a government contract, a defense contract in order to survive. And so, here's a couple of statistics. The 3 biggest manufacturing concerns in this country had 17% of the defense contracts. The 100 biggest concerns in this country had 82% of the defense contracts. My father, as I thought about this, a good example, my father was the best carpenter in Monticello. He hired 3 or 4 guys, they built houses. He had to go out of business. There wasn't anything for him to do. There were some 3 million small businesses that had to close their doors as a result of this red tape that was involved in getting government contracts, and the small business were just not suited either for the manufacturer or for handling all the red tape. Towns and cities that got contracts, they boomed. And towns and cities that did not get the contracts, they suffered. In Indiana, Jeffersonville got a boat, had a boat works. Charleston got an ammunition plant. Kingsbury, you're familiar with south of LaPorte. It boomed. Look at it now. Lafayette, the Alcoa plant, it boomed. But there were other cities who did not get that advantage, and they suffered. Migration from Kentucky, there was a tremendous migration out of what Johnson and Kennedy later would call Appalachia. But in those days, and I'm going to refer to this later on, they were just called hillbillies. They came out, and I'm not ashamed of that because my granddad was one and I don't care. But anyway, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Arkansas, there was a tremendous flight from these states to places where these defense plants were. They left, and they came out. Farmers. Farmers left the farm. And the statistics are rather interesting. There was 900,000 farmers per year between 1941 and 1945 left the farm. Now that compared to 375,000 per year during the Depression and 600,000 during the 1920s. So you see there was a big flight there. In 1945, there was 15,300,000 people that lived in different counties than they did in 1945. There was 7.7 million people that lived in a different state. And there was 3.6 million people that lived in a different part of the United States. Now let's take a look. Oh, and then the other migration was in the South. The sharecroppers and tenant farmers, a lot of them left that situation and went to the defense plants, and that of course included a lot of blacks. Let's take a look at where they went. Now these are percentages in change of population. And there's an old saying that liars figure and figures lie. Well, Mobile isn't a real big community as compared to San Francisco. So when you say that there was this much addition to their general population, remember in terms of how big was the place when the thing started. But this gives you some idea of the major population centers that were directly affected by this migration. Mobile, Hampton, this was a lot of defense there, and also the Navy was there. Hampton Roads, of course, is all Navy. San Diego is a lot of Navy and a lot of aircraft. Charleston is Navy, and so forth and so on. But you can see that there was the towns that got the contracts, they got the business. Let's take a look at women. 4.4 million women between 1941 and 45 went to work in the defense business. Now that is probably 3 million more than would have gone. They estimated that there would be 1.3 million that would have gone anyway. 56% of these women were married. 33% of the women were under the age of 20. There was 1/5 of these women that their husband was gone or their loved one was gone, and so from a sociological standpoint and a psychological standpoint, they wanted to help out. They wanted to do something. There were many older mothers who their sons were gone, and so they said, I'm going to go do something for my son. And they went to work. Let's take a look at some of the type of jobs. I want to backtrack a couple of things here. On this migration, I thought this was interesting. There was a Chinese laundryman, and he put this sign on the front of his laundry shop. He said, he was Glenn Toy from Seattle, a laundryman. Quote, "Go to war. We'll clean shirts after clean axes." And in San Diego, they said this. They said, one old-timer who had been in the Klondike and remembered what it was like in the gold rush of the Klondike, and like in San Francisco when this tremendous influx of people to the Klondike. And he said, "We used to go to bed at 10 o'clock. Now the cafes and the movies never close. They eat 50,000 hot dogs a day. 5,000 of them can dance at once." In 1932, 6 men worked at our aircraft plant. Now, 50,000 people work out there. Now, the old-timers did not particularly welcome these newcomers. And they said things like they lived like pigs. Well, what else did they lived in tents and they lived in trailers. They had no choice. They lived in foxhole houses. The schools were crowded. And then the old-timers who had already been there said, "Hope we can get rid of them after the war." So because of that, they did not support the government's effort to build public housing. See, they had the property, they had the mayor's jobs, they had the city council jobs, so they squelched all that stuff. And so they complained about the newcomers, but they didn't particularly help them out. And I think it's pretty interesting also to note the newcomers didn't want to stay. We said they migrated from Kentucky and Tennessee. They didn't want to stay. They looked forward to going back. They had land back where they were, and they looked forward to going back. Another little joke. It said there's 45 states in the Union now. Kentucky and Tennessee have moved to Indiana. And Indiana has gone to hell. Another quote. The hillbillies work for a while, and they save $50 in bonds, and then they go back home and live on it in the hills for 2 or 3 years. See, that was the sentiment. There was a lot of what we would call today child abuse. You know, mothers were working in the plants, and so they'd leave their kids in cars. There was one social worker in the San Fernando Valley counted 45 kids in cars in one day. My guy said, if that happened today, they'd go crazy. There'd be 45 mothers in jail and everything else. And another girl, 12 years old, was in a bar waiting until 12 o'clock so she could get a bed. You see, beds were at such a premium that people would sleep in them for 8 hours. They were called hot beds. And then they would get up, and then the next person would sleep in it. Maybe in the same family, maybe not if it was a hotel situation. So you're talking about tremendous overcrowding. Let's take a look at the women's jobs. What kind of jobs did they do? Well, they were riveters, they were welders, they were hydraulic press operators, crane operators, shell loaders, bus drivers, train conductors, bellhops, lumberjacks, lifeguards, cowgirls, section hands, filling station operators, taxi drivers, barbers, policemen, football coaches, ferry command pilots. And then the men got worried, and some of them worried about a new class of American Amazon coming on the scene that would outdrink, outswear, outswagger, and heaven forbid, outwork the American man. Women did not get equal pay, but I think this is in here someplace. Anyway, they did not get equal pay, but Roosevelt had an executive order, and Congress backed it up, and so they demanded that they get equal pay for equal jobs. I thought this was interesting. There was a controversy about women in the workplace, safety versus morale. It seemed that in Avoit Sikorsky assembly line in Texas, there were 53 women rounded up and sent home because they were wearing sweaters on the assembly line. And the reason was that it was not morally right. Well, the union and the women went back and they said, wait a minute, what about those women up in the office that are wearing sweaters? So then the company came back and said, well, it's for safety first. It said, you know, the sweaters get caught in the machines and they don't rip off as much and quick and so forth and so on. So they took this argument, it became an argument of the time, and there was a lady, a movie star, the name of Ann Sheridan. She was called the girl, and for obvious reasons. And anyway, they said, she said, they took this question to her, and she said, well, quote, a little girl in a big sweater was a safety hazard, and a big girl in a small sweater was a moral hazard. I imagine many of you veterans here remember Veronica Lake. You know, she had her hair that came down over her eye called peekaboo. Well, the defense workers were following her and their hair was hanging down. And so the defense muckety-mucks went to Veronica Lake and suggested that she change her hairstyle because they were afraid it was a safety hazard. She did that, and her career just went boom. It didn't work. She did her part for the defense also. 2/3 of the women who went to work during 41 to 45 stayed on the job. Let's take a look at marriages during this period of time. Marriages in 1940 went up 13.8%, 41, 7.3%, 42, another big percent. In the first 3 months, the sale of wedding rings went way up, particularly double ring ceremonies. Because you see, they're going away to war now, and the woman wanted some identification on the man as he went away. And 44, it went downward for a little while, and then 1945 it went back up, 9.4% increase in 45. Allotments. The first allotment, the idea was to get the psychological burden off of the soldier. And so they gave the woman $28. The government would give the wife $28 out of a private's pay, and the private would give $22 out of his pay. And so the woman had $50 allotment. Now, I read also where a lieutenant's wife was like $120 allotment. Well, it came to pass that there was this group of ladies, not a large amount of them, but anyway, they were called allotment Annies. And what they would do would hang around these naval bases, and they would latch on to some poor sailor that was about to set sail, marry him, and they could get that blue allotment check every month, see? And then the next sailor they saw, they'd marry him, and so forth and so on. Well, the most notorious was a lady by the name of Elvira Taylor in Norfolk, Virginia. And she had 6 husbands, sent in allotments checks, and she was working on her 7th. But 2 of her husbands were in a pub over in England, and they were changing photographs back and forth, and sure enough, they're the same photographs. So they had a fight, and the bobbies had to come and squelch it, but the bottom line was that they finally caught up with Elvira and sent her to jail and so forth and so on. Women were in the military, the wives, the waves, and the spars. All told, 285,000 women served in the military in World War II. This little song, again, made up by a man. The waxen ways will, it's to parley, parley, boo. I can't sing, but anyway, the waxen ways will win the war, parley, boo. The waxen ways will win the war, parley, boo. The waxen ways will win the war, what the hell are we fighting for? Dinky, dinky, parley, boo. See, the men were jealous of the women for this. Now, blacks, military, still segregated. September the 15th, 1941, 51% of all defense jobs were closed to the blacks. FDR executive order changed that. At the end of the war, 1944, 7.4% of the defense workers were black, but they made up 9.8% of the population. Unions were just as discriminatory. Don't kid yourself, they were just as discriminatory as the industry. Black women went from 50,000 in industry to 300,000. And this helped a lot of domestics in the South to assume another role. 700,000 blacks moved to a different place in the state that they were already in, and 400,000 blacks left the state altogether. Many of them came north and to the west for either Detroit or the West Coast defense plants. Rationing and shortages. Ration boards. Every county had a ration board, and it was under this big bureaucratic mess in Washington called the OPA, the Office of Price Administration. The first product to be ration was rubber. And when World War II broke out, it took 600,000 tons of rubber just to keep Americans on the road each year. And guess how much we had stockpiled? Another example of what has been mentioned here earlier. We had 660,000 tons stockpiled, so we just barely had enough to keep America going for a year. And Roosevelt, this is one of the places where Roosevelt really vacillated. He didn't want to stop people from driving because he knew that would really upset them. So he fooled around with this problem, and and the reason that gasoline was rationed was because they wanted to conserve rubber. Philippines were taken, there was no rubber. The South American, where we're going to get the rubber, the trees weren't big enough yet. We only produced 12,000 tons of rubber synthetics in 1940. So we just didn't have rubber. So the reason that they cut down on gasoline was to really conserve rubber, because the gasoline was here, particularly in this part of the country. Now there were three types of stamps: the A, B, and C stamps. And I remember, I can still see the old trucks having those A, B, and C stickers on it. The A was you get about 60 miles a week, or about 3 gallons of gas a week. How would you like to do that, some of you young guys? Get about 3 gallons a week to ride around. The B was a carpool, a little bit more. C was for doctors and people who really needed it. Truckers got all they wanted, and then there were some other people that got all they wanted. It was interesting to note that half of the Congress got all they wanted. Women's hose. I thought that was interesting. I thought that was interesting as far as shortages was concerned. First of all, they started out, and women were using silk from China. Well, of course, they couldn't use silk hose. Then they substituted nylon. And then they found out that each parachute took 36 pair of nylon. So they put that on the priority list. Then they started using rayon. And then they said, well, we can't use rayon. You can't use rayon because we got to use that in tires. So then they tried to use fine cotton aisle stockings. And they were about as popular as rhinestone wedding rings or engagement rings with the women. There was one of the people in the industry said, if we figured out a way to knit them out of grass one day, the next day the government would put a priority on grass. That's just how frustrating it was. Finally they ended up, and I remember this, that they painted their legs. You remember that? The women painted their legs, and then the more ingenious ones even painted a seam down the back, so that people couldn't see. Other things that went on as far as clothing is concerned. The women's clothes, there was no full skirts, no nice pleats, no patch pockets. Shoes came in 6 colors: black, white, navy, blue, and 3 black, white, navy, blue, 3 browns. The turban became popular. They said in one of the books it was Miranda, Carmen Miranda that did it, but another book said it was because they kept their hair up so they could work in the defense plants. Girdles were out, because that's rubber again, and so girdles were out. And there was a whole bunch of propaganda about how to look good without a girdle. Men's fashion suffered also. The victory suit had no lapels, no cuffs, no patch pockets, no pleats. I wonder what the dickens it looked like. Diamonds became $1 billion a year business, just like that, because people couldn't spend any money on anything, so they bought diamonds. The black market was referred to as Mr. Black. If you went to the black market and you got something, They say, where'd you get that? I said, well, I got it off Mr. Black. And it was a thriving business. I got for counterfeiting, black market and so forth, there were by 1944, there was 1,300 people convicted of gas black market. 4,000 were convicted of service stations, 4,000 service stations lost their license, and 32,500 motorists lost their A, B, or C stamps because they were cheap. There was victory bikes, shoes became rationed in 43, sugar, because of widespread hoarding and sugar, remembering World War I, there was they rationed that. Coffee was rationed in November of 1942, 1 pound per person every 5 weeks. Victory gardens, whiskey, canned beer, cigarettes, almost all gone because the soldiers, they went someplace else. Basketball sneakers, and I remember this because I was trying to play basketball. And they used this rubber that made black marks on the gym floor. You know, and then the coach was forever mad, and the principal was down there chewing us out, you know, don't make black marks. Well, how are you going to play basketball without sliding around on the floor a little bit? Bread was not sliced. You remember that? I remember that particularly. They didn't slice bread for a while. And then meat. This is interesting. Meat. Meat was rationed at 140 pounds per civilian per year. The Army gave their men 4.5 pounds of meat. The Navy 7 pounds of meat per week. So you see why those guys were lined up in New York. They're going to get 2.5 pounds more meat. Canned goods, meats and fish was meat and fish was rationed on February the 2nd, 1943. So forth and so on. Let's see. Okay. Then they had the food stamps were A, B, C, D listed. The blue were processed food. The red were meat stamps. We're about done. Trends, fads, and something else. Follies. You better not. Okay. People from 1941 to 45, people stayed at home more. They listened to their radio. 60,000 people listened to Roosevelt. But get this, 56,000 listened to Joe Louis. In his heavyweight, there's 2 heavyweight fights, but Roosevelt, when he made his famous, you know, the day that will live in infamy speech on December the 8th, 60,000 Americans listened in. I wasn't one of them because I was down by the urinal. Practicing the bomb drill. Parlor games and checkers were up. Book sales were up. See, people were staying at home more. Dancing, the jitterbug, the foxtrot, and the rumba became dances. Nightclubs. A guy that owned a nightclub said that he could tell how the war news was. If the war news was good, the crowd was up. If the war news was bad, people didn't come out. They just stayed at home and listened to the radio. The big bands, Betty Goodman and Tommy and Jimmy Dorsey and Harry James and the crooners, Sinatra, Martin, and Hayes. I found, this is just something I found interesting. I never knew this before. When Patton slapped the soldier, you remember that? Do you know that Eisenhower told the press corps, don't let that get out? And it did not get out for a month? Did any of you veterans know that? See, I never knew that. I thought that the day he slapped, that it was all over the world. But you see the difference between the media then and the media today. Ernie Pyle sold 670 books, 670,000 books, copy of his books. In 1944, St. Louis Browns won the pennant, and they had a one-armed player by the name of Pete Gray that played in the World Series. In Army, Davis, Blanchard, Tucker in the backfield, and then I think the guy's name was Barney Poole, but I think he's the only guy in the history of big-time college football to play 7 years, because he played 4 years for Army and 3 years for Missouri. I don't know what he was doing academically, but he did it. Last thing, milkweed and marijuana. I remember going out as a kid, and picking milkweed pods and throwing them in an onion sack and taking them in, and people paying us for them because they were substitutes for rubber. And then I also remember marijuana coming to Indiana. And, you know, I was young, probably 9 years old, and I remember George Spencer, who still has a farm just south of the farm that I live on. He had 60 acres of marijuana growing down there. They called it hemp. And, you know, we never thought anything about it. And then, but we did get suspicious because I remember they put it on hay wagons. You know, in those days it didn't have bales, but they just, you know, mounted it up on hay wagons. And when they took it over to Reynolds, Indiana to put it on the train, there was a little gray car that went along with it. You know, it was following along. And I remember asking my uncle, I said, you know, Uncle Clarence, why is those guys? And he said, that stuff will make you loco. Now, the volunteer growth is keeping sheriffs, and National Guard pilots, and everything else busy as we're running around trying to undo what we did in order to try to get rope when we didn't have vanilla hemp. Well, I think I'm about how many minutes? I'm about 5 minutes over. Unless you've got questions, that concludes my part. I appreciate very much your attention. It's a great privilege for... Doris was in this one. Participation program a little later in the series. While Jerry Hoover was speaking, something came to my mind that I haven't brought up for years. In early or mid-1941, a senator from Texas said, if the United States goes to war, by God, Texas will go to war too. The next portion of our program this evening will be an interview, and I think most all of you know Bob Brown. Bob, come on in, will you? Well, there's some way we can display this.
Well, I don't know how really, but if anyone hasn't seen the B-17, this is what they look like, especially younger people. This is a bomber, B-17, 10 crew members, 4 pilots, 4 officers, 6 enlisted men. The enlisted men were all gunners, or gunners.
This will give me an interview, so thank you. We'll get started here right away.
I thought I was scared when I bailed out. I think I'm more scared now.
Bob, if I'm not mistaken, you're a native of Rensselaer.
Right.
And you have one brother. More than one.
3 brothers.
3 brothers.
I'm the oldest. Jack, Tom.
Okay. I apologize that I didn't have the number of brothers right, Bob, because I think you were a freshman in high school in my senior year, and I really couldn't get much of a chance to find out about the Brown family. I was attended school for 2 years. And about all I knew about Bob Brown at that time was that he was a quiet freshman student. You graduated in 41. What did you do when you got out of high school, Bob? The war got started pretty soon after your graduation, didn't it?
The war was about to take place. Students seemed to be rather unsettled as to what to do. Felt like they would probably end up in service. And their different defense jobs opened up. There was a Kingsbury ordnance plant that started south of the port.
Were you 17 years old then, Bob?
Graduated from high school at 17 May. I was 18 in July, so actually I was 18. got on working at Kingsbury Ordnance Plant, first with the construction crew, building plant. And then I was able to transfer inside, and I worked as a bay foreman. Jerry mentioned there was many women that worked at that time. There was a bay foreman over 25 young girls, women.
You were living in Rensselaer at the time now, weren't you? You commuted?
We had carpools at the time for gas rationing. Although we were given extra gas for working in a defense plant.
Well, there were quite a few people in that community, weren't there, that trucked up there every day? And
Lots of people did that kind of.
was that plant open 24 hours a day, or how it was? Were they making artillery shells? Or
Basically, they were loading 20 millimeter shell.
20 millimeter shells?
In the bay that I worked, they brought in casings, they filled it with powder, and then it went on down. They put the projectile into a machine and put it into the casing and print it out as a finished
Now,
20 meter shell.
were all those projectiles just a lead projectile? Or were some of them incendiary, or were some of them armored piercings?
Well, they were armored piercings, but they weren't not the line that I worked.
An incendiary shell is a tracing that doesn't follow the shell as it's fired and correct the aim is recorded. How long did you work here, Bob?
I don't really remember just how long it was.
Well, how'd you stand in the draft? You were pretty young.
I was young, but I first decided I wanted to join the Navy, which I did, as you've heard about the Navy.
Was there any pressure on you to enlist in a military or anything like that?
Not really at the time. I just felt like I wanted to be a part of it. So I got a chance to get into a B-5 Navy program that was going on at college. And took the physical and ended up at Ball State, Muncie.
Well, did you ever have to register for the draft, Bob, or were you in the service before they required?
Yeah, I was registered for the draft during that time, but I was awaiting, and so that's why I went ahead and volunteered for the Navy. But my Navy career was rather short. I
Dishonorable discharge or anything like that.
I had a chance of staying in the Navy, Seaman second class, pretty low, or a discharge, honorable discharge. And so I decided if I'd take a discharge, I would volunteer and go into the Army Air Corps, and nobody would know anything about my name. So that's what I did.
You were interested in flying right from the very beginning. Why the interest in flying? Had you done any flying before?
Not really. I had an uncle who took me up an airplane ride when I was quite young, and I was fascinated by flying. I felt like I wanted to fly. So,
That sure beats being in the mud, doesn't it?
sure does, I thought. At least you come back to a clean bed most of the time.
Well, Bob, then when did you go into the Army? Did you?
I volunteered for the draft so that I could go earlier. Did that in March of '43. I'd been in the Navy. I was discharged in the Navy in January.
Well, how much input could you have in saying, well, now, here I am, but I want to be in the Air Corps? Did they pay any attention to you, or did you wind up in the Air Corps by accident?
No, as a rule, you ask for one thing and they give you something else, exactly the opposite. But I did luck out by, I think, volunteering to go early in the draft, before being drafted, so they did assign me to the Air Corps. I lucked out. Yeah.
Where did you take your boot camp training?
I left on the train here in Rensselaer, went to Indianapolis. Then from there, St. Petersburg, Florida, rough assignment. That was where they had the first phase of basic. It was at a country club golf course that they had taken over, which they took over quite a few of those in Florida during the war. And we lived in tents on the fairways and drilled.
Well, now, were you an aviation cadet, or were you...
No,
okay.
I had just volunteered. I wanted to be in the Air Force.
All right. Now then, after boot camp, did they steer you towards some specialty of aircraft mechanic or aircraft repair?
We took different exams. I qualified to go to what was called Armor's School, which an armor on the airplane took care of the bombs as far as actually arming them with fuses and things of it. And also, we had 50 caliber machine guns that we fired, and we were supposed to be able to take apart and put back together blindfolded 50 caliber gun before you could graduate from school. That school took 12 weeks.
And then you went through gunnery school, I presume, in order to become an aircrew member.
Right. And the gunnery school the armor school was in Laurie Field, Denver, Colorado, which was a great soldiers' town. People in Denver really treated servicemen great. They take them out, have them to their home, out for dinner, different things. It was known to be one of the friendliest soldiers' towns. After that, went to gunnery school, which lasted 6 weeks, and that was held at Nellis Air Force Base in Las Vegas. Another tough duty. See why I took the Air Corps? Although being in Vegas, we got into town once.
Is that right?
And that was after graduation.
Well, your training was very intense, wasn't it, Bob? Didn't they push you through every stage? It was a hurry-up deal.
Yeah, the gunnery school was 6 weeks.
Or you would get yourself in trouble later?
Well, you didn't want to fall behind and not graduate with your class.
Yeah.
So you made the extra effort to it was hotter than this, believe it or not, in Vegas on the desert gunnery school.
I believe it. Now then, after you completed your gunnery training, you were assigned to a crew, is that right?
Yes.
And how soon were you headed for overseas, into Europe?
Not too long after, well, we had 3 phases of training after gunnery school, after we were assigned to our group. It was, we were in Rapid City, South Dakota. It was the first phase, and we did high altitude flying at that point in our training. That was where I learned to drink coffee. I never drank coffee before that time, but always drinking Coke or coffee of some kind with high altitude. Carbonation didn't work too great, so I finally learned how to drink coffee.
Well, even in a summer day at high altitude, the temperature would be in the proximity of 0 degrees Fahrenheit, wouldn't it?
Right. It was very cold.
And then on up a little higher altitude, you can hit temperatures of minus 10, 20, 25, 30 degrees below.
30 and 40 below.
Keep in mind, folks, that these planes were not pressurized, and so each man had to wear an oxygen mask at any elevation above 10,000 feet. So you were breathing practically pure oxygen during that time, and it must have been quite an experience for a fellow who's never been up that high before.
It was an experience.
I can imagine.
It wasn't really pleasant having oxygen mask on your face. You course, goggles. The B-17 at that time, when we were taking training, had open windows, and I was a waist gunner.
Yes?
Right waist. So when you put the gun out the window, there was lots of air that rushed in.
A lot of air. Would you hold that in? Bob, let's take a minute and explain to these people in attendance about the various positions of the crew on this plane and the armament. Let's start up front in the bombardier's compartment and the navigator. Now, in the earlier model B-17s, those men had 2 machine guns, but they didn't fire completely forward, did they?
They were all kind of in an angle.
That's right.
Not directly forward.
And it didn't take the enemy long to find out that to attack a formation of B-17s, all you had to do is fly into them head on.
Right.
And shoot, make a pass, and dive under. And so then they wound up with a later model plane, a B-17G, and it had 2 turret guns under the bombardier there. Navigator was here. They've got the Astrodome for celestial navigation. Go ahead, Bob. Cockpit.
Well, pilot and co-pilot, the person in front, like Phil said, bombardier and navigator. This was your engineer gunner. Rode the top turret. The lower ball.
Higher.
Lower ball turret gunner was here. And then you had a left waist and a right waist gunner.
That was your position, wasn't it?
Yes, mine was in the right waist. And then a tail gun in the back. There were 6 gunners, 4 officers, although the bombardier and navigator could also serve as a gunner when they weren't busy navigating or bombing or whatever.
Well, this was a very obsolete plane. I think it was designed back in the early 1930s. And by the time they got it into production and everything, why, enemy planes were superior. The theory of this was, well, daylight precision bombing had never been done. Now, they've been bombing before that, but it wasn't precise. And there was a bomb site with this plane called the Norden bomb site. It was super secret. And so this plane largely was built around the Norden bomb site, wasn't it, Bob?
Yes, that's right.
This gun site, or bombing site, could be hooked to the autopilot of the plane, and on the bomb run, the bombardier's adjustments to that site would steer the plane to the target. So this required daylight bombing, and in order to protect these ships in daylight, they armed them from one end to the other. That's why the crew was so big, and why when one of these planes went down, it was a big loss of men. A big loss. Anybody have any questions about this ship? Okay, we'll move right along. Bob, how fast did it go?
Pardon?
How fast did it go? About 165, 170?
Yeah. It has the speed listed there. I don't remember. It wasn't fast enough.
I think you'll find that most bomb runs were planned in advance so that they would be bombing downwind to give them a high ground speed. And oftentimes that would necessitate a long maneuver around the target and then come in from the other direction.
It did hold 4,000 pounds of bombs. Remember that?
No, I disagree with you. It had
What?
6,000.
Okay.
2,780 gallons. I'm telling him.
Well, you were on a B-17 also.
No, I was under a B-17.
Oh, okay.
But 2,780 gallons of gasoline and 6 tons of bombs.
Okay.
And gee, did they make a noise when they blew up.
Yes, they did that.
All right. Now you moved out of the States and you didn't have to go over in a troop ship.
No, I was fortunate again that our complete bomb group went over as a unit, and we left West Palm Beach, Florida, and went through the southern route, South America, across to Africa, Dakar, up to Marrakesh, Tunis, and then eventually into Foggia, Italy for a base was. All that process took about a month. We did some practice missions in northern Africa. Of course, at that time, the Germans had been driven out of that area. We were flying over territory that Rommel had been in before he was driven out.
Then when you got to Italy, you were green as grass, no experience. You were a young kid that hardly shaved, and here we go. It's time for a mission.
Yeah, they split up new crew members, usually let them fly with an experienced crew. And that's what happened to me on being my first mission. I was flying with a crew that was on their 32nd, I believe. And it was termed to be a milk run. The milk run was supposedly a flight that there'd be very little opposition, no fighters, no problem. Just,
No anti-aircraft fire?
yeah, just go over and do it, come back.
Piece of cake.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, at about 10 o'clock, we found out that it wasn't a piece of cake.
At what altitude were you?
We were flying at around 20,000 feet. And we'd taken off from Italy, flown across the Adriatic, we're flying up the coast of Yugoslavia. Our mission was headed for Udine, which is a northern town in the northern part of Italy.
Now, what was your target there? Were you going in to blow up railroad
It
yards?
was a German aerodrome.
I see.
Before. But we were off. We didn't make it to the target. They were throwing up anti-aircraft fire, and they were exploding all around us. Like they used to say, it was heavy enough you could get out and walk on it.
Sure. You walk on the flat.
Right. And one of them hit our number 2 engine, and it caught on fire, and the pilot had to drop back out of formation. Of course, that's what the German fighters are waiting on to happen. They don't normally rush a group because there is so much gunpowder with all the planes flying in formation, but they sit up high and wait until someone is
Pounce on the straggler.
and then they pounce on it. And of course, that's what happened to us. And the fighters began to come in on, and which eventually got the job done. The plane began to burn quite profusely, and the pilot first gave the order to prepare to bail out, and then he more or less panicked and said, bail out, bail out, bail out, bail out. Just like to tell me to go out that door, I just went to the door and jumped. Everybody says, well, how do you do that? I don't know. Just do it, I can't.
Okay, now, this was your first jump of your life.
Oh, yeah.
The only jump of your life. Okay. Now, in your training, you've been trained what to expect and how to...
Not how to jump, though.
Well, you had parachute training. None?
Not until after I got back. Didn't have any before.
Okay. So you fell free of the plane, and...
The only training I had actually was, they used to tell you to count to 10 before you pulled the ripcord.
Yes.
Well, that made sense because you wanted to be free of the plane before
Yes.
you pulled. And that was actually the only training that I ever had.
Okay, count 10. One kid jumped out and they told him to yell Geronimo or something like that. And he came down and said, "What's the name of that Indian?"
Yeah.
Oh, Bob, getting back to this leap into space, have you any idea of what altitude you were when you left the plane?
We were flying at 20,000 feet.
I see.
And we were on oxygen. I might as well have jumped. There wasn't any more shells left in my gun. Because I got gun after really blasted away. But
No, in the right waist position, you were within about 8 feet of the escape door. Were you not?
yeah, that's right.
Well, let's explain that those doors are made so that in emergency, a special release lever can be pulled and those doors just fly out in the air. They're not in your way at all. Now, after you snapped in your parachute, you didn't lose your shoes or anything, did you?
No, thank goodness.
That's happened a good many times.
You know, we
Your
couldn't
shoes
go
pop
back.
off.
Bill, I was very lucky that day that I even had a parachute.
Is that right?
We were issued, the gunners in the waist had a chest, what they call a chest pack, where some of the pilot and co-pilot, they had a seat pack they sat on. To be more maneuverable in our position, we had what they call chest pack. But anyway, my harness, when we were taxiing to take off, wouldn't fit me. It was too tight because it had been fitted for heated flying, which it wasn't as
Much
bulky.
briefer, yes.
And of course, what I had on was a sheepskin, leather sheepskin jacket and pants. So I couldn't get the harness on. So I radioed to the pilot and told him that I didn't have a parachute. He said, "I think there's an extra one in the radio room." Well, it turned out there was an extra one in the radio room. And it was also quite tight. It took the other waist gunner and the lower ball turret gunner pull on the straps to get them to
Get you in.
to get the harness to fit at the button. So when I did finally jump, I had a different sensation, I think, because of it being so tight. Because after I was floating down in the parachute, I felt like I didn't have any legs. I felt like I was just, there wasn't anything, you know, I couldn't figure out what was happening.
Well, Bob, as you were descending, did you see any other chutes, any crew members in the air?
Yeah, I saw other chutes coming down. But I also saw that there was a German aerodrome over close to the coastline that I was more concerned with. And there was also German fighter planes that were circling.
They really had you spotted, didn't they?
Yeah, and of course the propaganda movies that they had out during the war showed some of the Germans and Japs were
Straight?
well, yeah, shoot LA people coming down in parachute. That naturally went through my mind. But I think really what they were doing was radioing my position in the ground so that they could pick me up.
Well, then you hit the ground. Or did
No,
you?
I hit a tree.
Hit the tree. Was that any advantage, do you think? Or was the ground under you pretty rocky and...
It was rocky and snow-covered. Of course, I always joked about that if I ever had to bail out, if I bailed out in the desert and there was one tree, I'd probably end up in. And I did. But I gave the excuse that since my harness was so tight, I couldn't raise my hands up into the shrouds of the chute to try and manipulate. So I really just fell limp and went into the tree.
All right, now when you were hanging there in the tree, did you have any injuries, Bob? Did you tear up your legs or your arms or anything like that? Or anything?
I had a little wound on my arm.
You released yourself from your harness.
Yeah.
did you have to take time to hide your shoes?
Yes, we were briefed that if something like that should happen, that is one thing we want to do is get the parachute and hide it. It was a little hard getting it out of the tree, but finally did and buried it in the snow.
All right, now then, were you briefed to vacate the area as soon as possible, or did you lay low, or?
At briefing that morning, because this was my first mission, my first briefing, thank God I paid attention to what they were telling me. They did say that we would be flying over Yugoslavia. They mentioned that Marshal Tito had a very good underground operation that worked in Yugoslavia. They also mentioned at the time that there was also another group, which was Mahalovic, and they said that you didn't want to get with that group. I don't really said that they cut your fingers off and all sorts of things. Anyway, Tito's.
How long did it take for you men to get together? You were scattered over a considerable distance.
Yeah. Well, I saw this one fellow walking up the mountainside as I was preparing to go down. I didn't have a gun because of my parachute things were tight. I left 45 in the plane. And I thought, well, I reached down and picked up a rock, and I thought, well, worst comes to worst, I guess I'd throw a rock at him. I don't know what good I thought that. Anyway, he wasn't dressed in
It was
uniform.
war, wasn't it?
Right.
Okay.
And they did tell us at briefing that the underground would identify themselves by showing a red star. And when I walked up to this fellow, he did show me that he had a red star.
Well, that saved your life, didn't it?
Sure did. And I also, we had an escape kit that had maps, silk maps, actually. And it came to our hickory. Anyway, I took out the map of Yugoslavia and was pointing to it, because I couldn't speak English. He understood what I was saying, so he pointed to the area where I was. Then we were told at briefing also to, if we were encountered by the underground, to do whatever they tell you to do. Even though it might seem foolish, you do it. So he motioned to follow it, and I did. It was a short time. We ran across several other members, and by early evening there was 3 or 4 of us. We got together at that time.
Did your entire crew make it or not?
No. Now whether it was navigator or bombardier, one of the officers fractured his ankle, and he landed on the rocks. He was with us for first day and night. The next day, we left him behind at an underground home, partisan home. I understand that later on he was captured. Really, I've never been able to find out for sure just what happened. I think he was
Bob, you had quite a trip getting out of the country, and we're running out of time. You're, with the help of the underground, how many days did it take you to get to a point where you can be picked up by an Allied plane?
It's been 45 days.
45 days. How did you fare for food and sanitation and things of that type?
Well, I didn't have my clothes off in 45 days. Needless to say, I was quite lousy at the time I got back.
You were sleeping in barns or anywhere else you could hide?
Wherever, although we did sleep in some of the homes, but we didn't take our clothes off. We'd take the shoes off maybe, or a jacket, but I mean, as far as anything else.
You had to be ready to move in an instant.
Right. So you needed to be prepared to leave.
These people that helped you, they were well organized, I presume, and guided you.
They knew exactly what was
and
going
kept
on.
you together. And I would imagine that your people assisting you would trade a little bit. In other words, it wasn't up to this handful of men to go all the way out
No,
or anything like
no.
that. You were traded as you went out.
They didn't even want the underground to know the complete route.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe this group would only know how to go 50 miles.
Mm-hmm.
And then there would be a new group that would take through their territory.
If
of
these
50
people in
miles.
this underground section were captured and tortured or anything like that,
They wouldn't know.
They couldn't reveal
Right.
the whole story, okay? And of course, that was just straight flat ground.
Oh, no.
No problems. You could just walk around at your leisure.
It was,
Look at girls and all that stuff.
well, there was a girl or two, but they were also underground, and they made us look.
They were tough, weren't they?
Yes, they were very tough. We
Very
would be
capable.
about ready to collapse, and they were still going.
Mhm.
Like a little bunny would be.
Did you, by any chance, keep track of how many mountains you climbed, and some of them you reclimbed, trying to avert
No, but
being captured?
I should have. But they always told us it was just over the next mountain. It was always just over the next one. And there was always, when we got over that one, there was always another one staring us in the face to go across.
About how many miles did you travel? Any idea, Bob?
I was looking through the paper. It's in my scrapbook. When I got back, it said 600. I didn't think it was that far.
Mhm.
I don't know whether that got exaggerated or whether I exaggerated,
That
but I
was-
think it's around 500.
That was on your 2 feet.
Yes.
We were able to move pretty well in 48 days.
We moved. We had to keep moving.
And when you received some assistance in a community and were moved on down the line, would you tell these people some of the things that happened to the citizens in that community as a result of their being helped?
Well, they were great people, and they did whatever they could to help us. They were willing to give us anything that they had as far as food, but it was quite scarce because we were in the smaller villages, but the Germans occupied the whole territory, and they would also come in to these small villages and
Take food.
take the food, but they were quite crafty in hiding their women and their wine. It seemed like there was always plenty of that. I mean, girls were there, their wives. They took their lives in their own hand as far as, I know that there were several that lost their life because of us.
Just helping your crew.
Of course,
All right.
we weren't allowed to carry guns. The underground was armed, but had we been caught with a gun, we would have been considered as a spy under Virginia the Conqueror, so we weren't to be armed.
You wouldn't see the daylight of the next day, would you? Bob, this trek out to freedom must have really been a terrible struggle, and I imagine that every member of the crew was tempted or tested rather to the very limit of his endurance. How did your crew members hold on?
Well, the actual crew held up quite well. We ran across other members from other crews. We had quite a large group by the time we got out. There was one officer in particular that was just a real crybaby. He just complained
And
all
what
the
nickname
time.
did you give him, Bob?
He ended up being called Whiny.
Well,
Poor
he
Whiny.
was-
He was going to quit, and we finally told him to just quit and stay there. But
Good riddance.
right.
This was an officer.
Yeah.
And
I might add that my pilot, of course, I didn't know any of these fellows.
no,
That was my first mission. He sort of took me under his wing, and he took care of me pretty well, although we pushed each other. He was about ready to give up, and I'd push him on, and I'd be ready to quit, and he'd push me on. It got so that it was...
Do I understand that some of these towns you went through were later bombed by the Germans in retaliation for helping you?
They seemed to know exactly where we were most of the time. Our walk started out, we were to what they called the short route, cut across to the Adriatic Sea, and they were going to take us back by boat. But the only problem was we had to go through a German occupied village and road. So for 2 or 3 days they tried to prepare us for that trip. And this particular night when we were trying to sneak through the village, and we were close enough that we could look in the windows and we could see the Germans laughing and drinking and playing cards and all this and that. And we would slip by a few at a time, and all of a sudden some dogs started barking quite loud. It wasn't long after that shot at the incendiary bombs, which lit up the area like daylight practically. So, needless to say, we really had to get out of there and in a hurry. And after that, we backtracked.
Some more mountain climbing.
Some more just over the other mountain. But we had to hold up in a town, and they told us that we weren't going to be able to go the short route. And I don't know how many miles the short route was, but anyway, they said you're going to have to go the other route, which is down through the country of Yugoslavia, eventually end up at Marshal Tito's headquarters.
How much weight did you lose during this period, Bob?
I don't know, but I ended up with a 28-inch waist. And I'll never see that again. I don't really know how many pounds. I was quite thin.
I'm sure you were. Well, as was everyone else.
Yes. They just didn't have anything to give us. We had...
Probably get a crust of bread maybe once a day or something
Yeah,
like that.
they made a bread, I swear it was made out of straw, because we nicknamed it straw bread, because when you chew it, you get straw in your teeth, you were pulling it out. But they had a soup that was, I don't know, dropped the bone in, I guess, and pulled it back. But I didn't have to eat bugs and leaves, and like that guy that was only down for a day or two, and we were down 45, so I don't know why. We didn't have a little more stamina than that.
Well, Bob, we're running out of time here. As a matter of fact, we've run a little over time. Would you tell us about how you got out of Yugoslavia?
Well, like I said, when they said we couldn't get out on the short route, we headed south, and we endured several experiences during that time, of course. But eventually we did end up at Marshal Tito's headquarters. And the Allies were flying in supplies to Tito by parachute. And they were in contact by radio and one thing and another. And we were told that we were going to be flown out of there. They didn't have an airstrip as such. They had a field that was out the edge of town, and they would light smudge pots, and the plane would come in at night.
Not to be under cover of darkness.
And the injured, of course, were taken out first. While we were there in this town, thinking about the Germans seemed to always know where we were. They came over and strafed that town every morning. And it got to be kind of a joke that we'd say rise and shine and Stuka time. Because they seemed to be, at 6 o'clock here they were. But
Stuka was a enemy aircraft.
yeah.
6 o'clock Stuka time.
Yeah.
Well, Bob, you must have really anticipated getting on that plane. Did Whining fly out with you?
I don't really remember what happened to Whining. I gave up on him, I guess. I don't really.
It didn't matter, did it?
I didn't really care.
Yeah.
I was taking care of my own hide.
Absolutely, absolutely. Have you ever, you've heard from most of your crew members since then, haven't you?
Yeah, I kept in contact with my pilot primarily over the years. And then just a few years ago, we discovered that there was actually another crew member in Lafayette.
Is that right?
And he'd been there all this time and didn't really know it.
Well, that's typical of wartime, to lose all contacts with everybody.
And we have also found another crew member that is in Iowa. The four of us are going to get together September the 10th. We're going to go over to Rantoul to Chinook Air Force Base. They have a new museum over there that is quite nice. Here a couple of weeks ago, they have added a new exhibit that the Slovenians brought over and put in the museum, and it is a tribute to, I guess, the Allied airmen that were shot down. They were able to get out of that country. Of course, now they're a separate country of their own, but at that time they were also a part of Yugoslavia. But
Robert Braun is listed in that museum over there as being honored by the country.
Well, they say they got back 305 airmen, and they have our names listed. Center plaque there. So we stumbled onto this, didn't really know. A friend from Champaign called and said this was going on. So we jumped in the car and went over, and we were so impressed with it that that's why I'm going to meet there with the pilot and two other crew members.
As soon as you got back to Italy, you were rotated back to the United States? That's understandable, Bob. I certainly thank you very, very much for doing that. One thing this man did that was forbidden at the time was my voice. He kept a diary. This was strictly forbidden in case you got captured. To be able to derive, the enemy would derive a lot of information undetected. You hear me? Okay, so Bob broke the rules and kept a diary. And just within the last very few years, Bob's wife and Bob's pilot's wife, Star City, Iowa, began to hear these guys talk a little bit, years and years and years after the war. The result is that Kay Munson, the pilot's wife, along with Bob's diary and a lot of help from others, has written this book called Out Over the Balkans. And they just happen to be available. If anybody wants a copy, here's your man. And believe me, it's the most incredible story. We only begin to scratch the surface of Bob's experience here tonight. Really, we haven't. But the book goes into considerable detail, and I was lucky enough to get a copy of my own. I read it cover to cover, flipped it over, and reread it just so I wouldn't miss anything. It's a fascinating story, and it's incredible that Bob and his crew got out of there alive. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Dr. Kenny, have you anything else this evening?
I'll see you all next Thursday.